Hello and welcome to Conversations with the Voice of Reason. I'm your host, Benjamin Boyce, and today's conversant is Anna Riedl, who is a researcher who focuses on cognitive science, whatever that is. That's actually what we get into in this conversation. And we talk about the modern and postmodern condition and where that intersects with meaning making and the structures of language and the brain and even institutions. Fascinating woman. I'll have her back on because she really wanted to talk about the intersection of bodybuilding and right-wing based politics, or at least political ideology. But for this conversation, we just get into cognitive science, whatever that means. You can find links to her work down there in the description, as well as links to support this channel. Without further ado, here is Anna Riedl. So we met at ARC.
Wait, we did?
Didn't we? Did we not?
Possibly. Did we? I don't know.
You met a lot of people there, huh?
I did meet a lot of people there.
What was your intention on attending, and how did that work out for you?
So, well, that brings me straight to my entire life story. So I've been going through quite some big transitions there, changing my political beliefs, changing my, non-religious beliefs. And I wanted to both just engage with this kind of crowd, and one part was also, in particular, the kind of the Christian touch to it. Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Do you
And there
have
were
a
also some specific people I was in particular looking forward to meeting, of course.
Yeah, there was a lot of big names there, and small names too.
Yeah.
Speaking of
Yeah,
myself.
often the small ones were more important, to be honest.
Why the Christian part? Did you grow up in surrounded by Christianity, or was there an absence of Christianity?
I grew up Catholic, and then, well, got all the normal steps done that you would if you grow up in uh, Christian conservative Bavaria in Germany. But then during my teenage years, already left the church. I didn't really see any meaning in it, and I actually became quite a literal explicit atheist. So 10 years ago today, I was even on a TV show opposing a female, I guess, priest as me, the atheist, and her, the Christian. And well, it has been quite a transition back, I would say.
What was the kernel of your descent towards religion or the church? So,
Why I felt like leaving?
not just leaving, but being against it.
Mm. Well, I think part of it is, well, I guess like the literal, slightly Marxist or just a liberal frame of seeing it as, well, traditional, therefore backwards, therefore irrational, therefore partially oppressive. And I think the most important part was really that I didn't find meaning in it, and I felt like it was actually contrary to the things that were most important.
It would interrupt your, I don't know, seeking of truth in a way by bogging you
Yes.
down in a bunch of theology and other
Yeah,
non-concerns kind of stuff.
exactly.
Yeah. But so when you leave the church, you leave the framework of meaning. What framework of meaning did you adopt then?
Well, in retrospect, I would say liberalism. Back then, a lot of, well, right, like believing in science, in reason, and then also definitely early on already engaging with other wisdom traditions, right? Reading Buddhism, finding, well, all other attempts at making sense and meaning in the world,
Hmm.
which I still cherish a lot.
Yeah. And like, what was your community doing or your generation doing in your country? Where was it headed? And did you find a lot of solidarity with like a general movement towards liberalism and away from Catholicism, or towards progressivism beyond liberalism?
Mm. So I found a lot of meaning in, well, right, living a good life for myself. According to, you can still follow very deep principles. Quite, there's no shortage of deep, meaningful things to pursue. And then the other part that I found very important was, well, improving the world, right? So For me, this started out actually with, in my case, veganism, because it just felt like, or at first vegetarianism, then veganism, because it felt like something so apparent where there was something really cruel going on, right, where I could just do the right thing and avoid a lot of suffering in the world. And then later I joined the effective altruism community, where, well, the whole goal is, right? uh, First of all, ask yourself, how can you do the most good? And then second of all, how can you, yeah, well, how can you, let's now actually do it, right? Once
Hmm.
you've answered the question.
That leads you down, from what I understand, effective altruism leads you down to some sort of economic mindedness, or like if
Yeah.
you're trying to really do the most good, then you start to abstract the good into channels of good. Did
Yes.
you feel like you did good things by pursuing procedure, process, institutions?
Ineffective altruism in particular.
Yeah, or just with that as your umbrella, do you feel like that was
Mm.
making an impact, as they say?
Yeah, so I said this a lot, by the way. I was in many stages telling people about how to have an impact. So, well, I do think it does have some impact, and I do think, as the idea goes, right? So, effective altruism is about the a marginal impact theory, assuming everyone usually does the normal things, right? Then there's probably some things of ethical value that are marginally undervalued, where one can make a difference. And I think some of these things are, in fact, very relevant. And I still agree with in general, well, just being open to different approaches, being open to changing one's mind. And I think some of these efforts are still meaningful. And if more people would work on them, that would not be a bad thing. So, for
Mm-hmm.
example, let's say eradicating lead exposure, right? Like even if you care about your own nation, having less just like extremely stupid and violent people globally is, I think, pretty straightforward. Not a bad thing. Yeah, so you can also translate it to other fields. But I've otherwise completely come around and just seen that it is not a total theory of morality at all. And I'm actually in collaboration with the Sky Meadow Institute with Brandon Graham Dempsey, currently writing a kind of a theory as a counter perspective.
Hmm. What would that theory begin with? Where does it start? How do you build such a theory?
Um, so it's called Autoethics, and it flips some of the main assumptions. So some of the main assumptions of effective altruism are based on Peter Singer and Derek Parfit and many others, that you have to aspire to a view from nowhere, right? You should care about people and beings as if you were the universe, which is basically as if you were God, right? I should care about any shrimp on the other side of the globe in proportion to its suffering relative to all the people that are around me. And both in science as well as I would say in ethics, it's relevant to, first of all, consider that the first person perspective is true and important, and that we cannot even, what does it even mean to try to have an objective view on the world, right? So you have to just accept that you are a first person, you are a person in a specific context that should also care about things relative to, well, yourself, right? Because uh, you have less information about other people. You don't even know what other people fundamentally want. And also it is quite costly to your own life as well. So you can yourself lead a far less good life in a sense.
Hmm. There's that popular heat map that
Yes.
I know there's more than one way to read it, and maybe you can say how you read that because you're more trained in reading those kinds of things. But it basically clumps the conservative, what is most important. Conservatives tend to care more about what's closer to them,
Yeah.
and liberals tend to either extend their care farther or actually place their care farther away from home.
Yeah.
Why do you think that is? Like, what's the well? There's several readings to it. I heard like It could be
Yeah.
read as just virtue signal. People say that, they report that because they think that that's what they should do in these two different ways. But assuming that it's authentic, why would liberal-minded people care more or care further than conservative people?
Um, I don't I don't think they care. Wait, sorry. Can you say it? Whether they care more or further?
Yeah, I kind of
More.
misformulated that. Care more about what is further, or care, or spread their care further.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So I don't think they care more about what is further away than what's close, but they care more about what's further away relative to conservatives. So their moral circle is more expanded. And I think, again, if you assume right limited resources of attention and just time to actually in practice do something for different entities, it means they do in fact care about their in-group lower, like they have to, right? Because it's just spread further. Well, I think the positive point here is just well, it's in effect true that these things do matter, right? Trees do matter to some degree. Animals matter. A lot of things, right? There is a lot of reason to have some reverence for all these entities, and I
Hmm.
think that would be the positive view to just be like, what does intrinsically matter? What would intrinsically this be deserving of care? And I think the opposite view from the conservative side is more, well, but to care properly about what I'm actually responsible for, I do have to make the direct trade-off. I don't think most conservatives would say, okay, like destroy all the trees, right? I don't think they think that. I think they just are more grounded in their immediate field of action and understand that certain things have to then be disregarded to do what you are practically responsible for properly. What's your view on that? I mean, you're here for asking questions, but what do you think?
Well, I guess I wonder to what degree why we think of it in terms of conservative and liberal, and what it is about the liberal framework that prioritizes maximizing care for the universe, and what it is about the conservative mindset that maximizes care for the immediate self, family, neighborhood, town, then state, then country, then etc. I wonder if that's a particularly Western point of view or particularly
Yeah,
elite point of view, a cosmopolitan point of view, the liberal point of view.
maybe both.
Yeah.
But something that's uniquely Western is having universal values, right? Like asking what should everyone rationally believe and one could converge towards, which is it. So universal ideas are a contextual idea, as in only Westerners have them.
So they're not universal.
Exactly. This is why in context you can also not right actually live by these principles because well, if you are in a game theoretic situation with other people that don't agree to hold universalist ideas, then it doesn't make sense in context to live by them.
Well, in certain contexts, yeah, you can only go
Yeah.
so far. And that's why we see a lot of, I'm just opining here, why we see a lot of liberal hate or just negative regard for conservatives, because the liberals attack that which is closest because the closest is getting in the way of the furthest, in a way. If that makes sense, I wonder if that's coming across, right? Because there's a lot of contention in the West between liberals and conservatives. And it seems like the liberals
Yeah.
don't really have a frame of reference, let alone respect for the conservative point of view. That doesn't seem like they can argue the conservative point of view, whereas conservatives basically have to be aware and argue for the liberal point of view. And the liberals kind of end up suppressing, attacking, and disregarding conservatives with a plethora of talking points. But conservatives do that as well to liberals.
Yeah, I mean, if I would try to make a fair synthesis or argument, then well, the liberal view is that well, other things also do matter, and if you very much care for yourself and, for example, your family, you might in fact overstep the relative value of other things, right? You might, for example, I don't know, go on a very intense hunting trip with your sons, have a lot of fun, but then kill a bit too many lions because it's just some fun for your family, right? So I think there is some meaningful dialectic here, that
Hmm.
being too focused on yourself is in fact also, of course, a failure, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So
Right. I mean, of course.
so of course there's going to be balance between these two points of view.
Yes.
Have you seen your own heat map kind of switch,
Yeah.
and where and
Yes.
how did you start to find the balance? What made makes sense for you to start to balance those two trends?
So I was very explicitly inspired by people like Peter Singer, who talk about the expanded moral circle. I was very inspired by effective altruism, and I basically approached my entire life by asking myself, who do I have to be to produce the best positive outcome for everyone in the world? And you might quickly realize that this is completely not feasible in any way. It makes you actually unable to act because you just do not know what the world in its entirety might possibly want you or need you to be. Um, and I don't think I have a completely balanced heat map yet, but what I had to do was to just to stop asking this question and accepting that I'm a first person that deserves to also have a good life and can for some time completely ignore the impact on other people and build her own life and just cut all the other questions off. So I have this extreme um, centering on myself for some time and to just in a sense survive, because you're getting very like it's impossible to calculate the answer to this question. It's a stance that's literally not human anymore, and therefore very
Hmm.
destabilizing. So in a sense, I had to become human, and I intend to only later invite the question in again, where I can contribute to the lives of others.
Yeah. What was the breaking point in your autobiography, or like a very terse autobiography? Well, actually, it's a very extensive autobiography you sent me. You went all the way up into the World Economic Forum. So you had extended your practice of effective altruism to transcend humanity itself, right? You to what degree did you lean into all that stuff, and what was the breaking point? How far did you go, and
Yeah,
what was the
you,
breaking point?
you know, uh, I'm reading just Twitter or what people are writing, and it's really infuriating when you look at your own story and you feel like you've somehow become a parody of a certain stance and you couldn't see beyond it. Like it's just, yeah, vegan, World Economic Forum, transhumanist, close to antinatalist, right? Like the whole package in a sense.
Yeah,
Um,
climate change
and
before babies, right?
Oh,
I guess.
not so much about climate change, but just suffering is bad. Therefore, I actually never fully became an antinatalist, but many
Yeah.
people around me, they were negative utilitarians, and I was actually defending that. Well, I think people should do what they want, and it felt always wrong to me. But I was definitely surrounded by a lot of antinatalists. So, right, it's very painful to actually look at this and. There's
Hmm.
this quote by is it Dostoevsky with your worst sin is that you betrayed and destroyed yourself for nothing.
Hmm.
And for me, I feel like the most painful part is that it was my attempt to take ideas very seriously, to look to institutions with seriousness and effort, and to live according to the best principles institutions I should trust uh, taught me. So in the sense, I oriented myself to who reasonably should be expected to teach me the true, the good, and the beautiful. And I put a lot of effort into embodying it and taking it seriously. And now I have to look around and actually feel quite betrayed.
Really?
Yes,
What what's flipped the switch? What was the moment, the breaking point, the turner, or the waking up moment?
it was a very long journey.
Just like
Many
threads,
many
just
individual
tugging.
hits
Yeah.
where ideas didn't make sense, where, right, I mean, there's this, you probably know Kuhn, right? The paradigm shift of the scientific revolutions. And there's a similar idea in cognitive science of the cognitive science of science, how, right, you have a theory and then you start to detect anomalies where you notice, well, this doesn't make sense. Or, could it be the other way around, right? But it doesn't add up yet. And then there's this very dark night of the soul where nothing makes sense anymore and you're very disoriented. And well, but I mean, we can talk through, for example, books that made an impact on you. Is that interesting?
Sure, you can list a few.
Okay, so I think for me, before books, one important experience was studying with Nassim Taleb. He has a workshop in New York called the Real World Risk Institute, and he's of course, yeah, quite value-wise, I would say, quite conservative. So it was actually about statistics and how to deal with uncertainty. And I think there's a lot of, right, like a lot of ideas about how top-down controllable the world is and measurable. And I think there were quite some deep principles in there that already left some impact on me. And then, well, over time, I think the people that were most relevant were, of course, Jordan Peterson, as for probably most people. Then Jonathan Haidt with the moral foundation theory. He has this episode with Julia Galef where she explains her worldview to him, and he basically tells her, "Well, you're kind of living in flatland, right? Basically, you're having the two-dimensional view, but there's a three-dimensional view out there." And the more engaged with his understanding, I understood there were moral dimensions that I was completely blind to, and that were in fact very important to track other, well, dimensions of value in the world and also for action, right? Because you cannot
Hmm. Yeah.
just using care and harm is totally not sufficient. And then, well, Nassim Taleb, I said, Julian Baggini has a book called How the World Thinks.
Hmm.
He's a philosopher, and he just describes different global, well, world philosophies. He's a Western philosopher. He noticed he's not a philosopher; he's a Western philosopher. So, what other philosophies are out there? And there's a chapter in there where he, for example, talks about hierarchies that really, I feel like that was the moment, for example, my understanding there clicked, that
Hmm.
a simple egalitarian understanding is not actually the best to create the most value. So he gives this example of a teacher with his pupil. And well, if you would now make a very like a master in his field, sit like a pupil with all the rest in a room, everyone would lose out. Everyone would be worse off because the correct role in this environment is for the person with more knowledge to teach the others.
Hmm.
And it's mutually benefiting. And this was a very simple example where, for me, well, I guess I jumped out of the very egalitarian framing I had before.
Hmm.
Other than that, James Scott, Seeing Like a State, was very powerful for me. And James Burnham was the final punch reading Suicide of the West.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What could you, for my audience, just encapsulate the message and how it impacted you? The Suicide of the West.
Um, so, well, okay, you're a fish in water, and someone writes a book and describes water to you.
Oh.
So, what he does in Suicide of the West is first argue that liberalism is an ideology, that it has a specific way of ordering its fundamental values, and that there are very explicit beliefs underlying it, and that there are meaningful or reasonable alternatives to these views.
Hmm.
So, for example, one is that every human or humanity in general has the potential for infinite betterment. That there's no, right? The alternative is there is a certain human nature that, well, of course, it can change over time, it can also improve, but there's also just some way humans are. And there is not this infinite potential for everyone to just try more and then we'll have utopia, which
Hmm.
is very trivial once you think about it, but basically writes 19 such beliefs. And it turned out I think I had most of them. And it was the first time I noticed, oh, I didn't even understand. I was holding beliefs and there are alternatives because it was just so strongly a lens I was holding.
Hmm.
And yeah, I think reading certain books, it can truly feel like some exorcism, and it's a physical process to just deal with the fallout.
Yeah. Well, literally, you start like chewing on bacon one day. You just wake up and you say, "Screw it, I'm going for the."
Yeah, I wish that wasn't true, but it is.
Uh, in exploring post-liberal thinkers who are alive right now, and the thinkers that they're basing their thought on, I see that there's a lot of pushback from liberals, and some of it is warranted, and some of it is defensive. I think, in my estimation right now, liberalism has certain flaws that we have to address, and there are certain benefits from it that we do not want to lose. And some
Yes.
very explicit things are: we don't need to go back into a caste system based on race or on sex. We don't need to roll back female rights, and I don't think we could if we wanted to. I don't think, because you have to actually sell women on this too, because they're a part of humanity. So those are
Thank you.
two kind of very. You're welcome. Those are two explicit examples, but in your process of reevaluating your liberalism, what are some essential aspects of liberalism that we should, we ought to preserve? And if we can find a few of them, how do we reincorporate them into a more holistic, authentic, and sincere ideology going forward? Big question.
Well, I'm gonna take this question and answer a different one.
Okay.
So there is this a movement, a different one called Metamodernism. I don't know
Mm-hmm.
whether you've heard about it. Yeah,
I've
you
heard
have.
about it, but I always I get lost
Yes.
in the footnotes. Haha.
Yeah. Um, and in this framework, there is a very good understanding of, well, there are, right, like perspectival realism. Different systems describe different parts of reality.
Yeah.
And especially in the political system, this seems to be true that there are, well, different perspectives that see some things that the other one doesn't see, and a lot of the integration, like the approximation of truth or what's good, is in the dialectic between those two. Now, I'm not saying that it's perfectly capable in doing so, but I don't. Right, in a sense, in a sense, I agree that we need exactly this interplay between the different sides, and over time, that's well where we come out.
I'm sorry, by
But that
different
does not
sides, are you talking about like different levels of analysis, or are you talking about like different sides? What do you mean by
political.
sides? Political sides. So there is
Yeah.
a coherent right and a coherent left.
No, that would be in detail,
Okay.
that would be a different claim. Yes. No, just that
Okay, good.
I'm basically just making a claim that if you want to track something very high dimensional in the world, you usually need reductions and then different perspectives, and they can each see
Okay.
valuable parts of reality. And just saying one side is right, the right one, or false, is oversimplified. And basically believing in the process is overall the stance that makes sense to me.
Hmm.
Other than that, do you want to remind me, because you asked what aspects of liberalism I find like crucial to maintain? What can you make some points of, like, what do you see as the main aspects of liberalism, or what are the
Well,
main argued ones usually?
I was stepping off from James Burnham's, like you said, there's 19 points or 19
Yeah.
assumptions or axioms of liberalism. And I think perhaps his overall point was that we need to understand this thing as an ideology,
Yeah.
and then, see it not as all bad or all good, but see what its worth is and what its failures are.
Yes.
So when one becomes post-liberal, just like when one becomes a post-Catholic,
Yeah.
they have a phase of being anti-Catholic. But eventually you grow out of the anti-Catholic. Or, somebody, usually
Yes.
a teenager grows out. It's a developmental process. You grow up in a
Yeah.
religion, you go outside of the religion. You have to actually get that religion out of you in order to understand yourself. But then at some point you stop the whole rebellion thing and you start to integrate. And I
Yes.
think that a lot
Yes.
of what's happening right now in current discourse in these hyper online spaces, which eventually do have real world effects, but I'm just saying they are bubbles and it's kind of madness in there. But there is a reaction to liberalism happening right now in
Yes.
in right wing discourse. And the classical liberals are really trying to hold the boat together, and they're failing at it by trying to appeal to institutional authority while the institutions have already failed. We already know that they failed.
Yes.
So the classical liberals need to let this process happen and enter into actual good faith dialogue with their critics.
Yes.
And their critics need to actually understand that liberalism isn't the enemy. It's just something that they are deconstructing in order to find a better synthesis. So I'm wondering, like, what parts of liberalism, once we test it, we go through a post-liberal kind of phase or anti-liberal kind of phase and then say, well, okay, I don't want to actually, I don't know, have a king. I don't know. Like, there's all these different alternative viewpoints. And liberalism gives us some ideas, like maybe democracy to a certain extent, right? Or representative democracy. Like, okay, maybe I'm way off in the weeds here. How do we reincorporate hierarchy
Mhm.
into the post-liberal environment? I think hierarchy is a sticking point for liberals and a sticking point for the critics on the right. They both want to, liberals want hierarchy installed in expertise and process. And it seems like the dissidents want hierarchy installed in different ways, either in the state, like through a strongman, Red Caesar, through the church, like through some sort of theocracy to a certain degree, maybe reincorporating Christian or Western values into the political process. And then there's the libertarians who don't want hierarchy at all, but they end up thinking with their heads a little too much. I'm kind of losing myself in the question. Do you have any
Yes,
responses
it's
to
a big
anything that I
question.
said? Yeah.
I'm not sure I have a I'm not sure I have a good answer because I think in the
I'll take a response.
practicalities
You
of
don't have to answer.
what the different sides are, that's not where I'm very well versed in.
Yeah.
I think many of the questions or like the sub points where there isn't a disagreement, they can very well be just nicely integrated, right? So,
Mm.
for example, when you look at James Burnham and the beliefs he mentions when it comes to what is typical of liberalism and what is the alternative, one is, for example, the question of violence, where you put it in the ontological stack. How real is violence, right? We can just be friendly people. We don't need any violence. We can solve all our problems purely by conversation or dialogue or diplomacy. And I think that's fundamentally not true. I think violence is just game theoretically exactly very deep in the ontology. You cannot discuss it away. A lot of things are grounded in physical force
Mm-hmm.
and well, just its reality. But again, I can actually point to meta-modern literature. I think there's like two failure modes, right? One is I can say, okay, everything is violence. I have to solve everything by military conflict because violence is real. This would be game acceptance, right? Saying, oh, it's real, therefore I reify its reality. I take it as more real than it actually is and see it
Mm.
everywhere. While the alternative is exactly this idea of like, well, we have reality, right? We have civilization. We're mostly free of violence. And then some people in this context sometimes sprinkle some violence on top and we can just avoid it. So this is equally wrong. And there are some, right? Some
Hmm.
conflicts of interest are simply real. So you won't just solve it by communication. But I think the process, for example, of dialogue or diplomacy, it does unearth information. And I think good diplomacy, good dialogue can minimize the conflict to where it is absolutely necessary.
Mm-hmm.
Through the exchange of information, you can at least minimize it, but you shouldn't be naive that there is some real conflicts of interest as well. So you have to both be ready to accept this reality and be ready to do your best to minimize it at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah. Another line or vector of inquiry would be around suffering. You said something when you were describing your liberal era that suffering was bad and suffering should be minimized.
Yeah.
I wonder if suffering is just like violence. Suffering is a part of the human condition, and the job isn't to eradicate it, because then you would end up eradicating humanity. It seems
Yes.
like that's the outcome. It's to mitigate it and to understand it in a different way, to integrate it, perhaps. And I think that one of the beauties of, I can't speak for all religions, but of Christianity is how it articulates suffering and articulates how to address that suffering. It allows for people to, try to minimize suffering without trying to extinguish suffering. And it also allows people to integrate the suffering that they experience into a broader narrative, into a process of spiritual development.
Yes.
What about hierarchy?
That seems correct. Wait, how are we coming from suffering to hierarchy?
One thing that is, at least in America, and you're German, and it's very
I'm
evident you're
German.
German. And I wanted to do more
I'm
inquiry into
sorry.
your Germanness. How do you integrate your Germanness into things? I want to get deeper into that, because it's very interesting and amazing that you're German, and it just like manifests in your way that you think about things and your values. It's just like in your core. But in America, we are ostensibly anti-authoritarian, but
Yeah. Yeah, it's very different in Germany.
we're
Still is.
anti-authoritarian only when authority's not going in our direction, and that's kind of the trick we play on ourselves. As long as authority's heading in our direction, we don't think that there's any. As long as power is going in our direction, we don't have a problem with power, right? As long as like the liberal society is continually becoming more and more liberal, we don't mind, and we ignore the powers that be that are steering it along, the nudges and the education and the indoctrination that steers us towards
Yes.
more and more progress until it starts to erupt, as it has in the last 10 years.
So what's the question of hierarchy in this context?
Well, I guess how's Germany accepted liberalism? How did Germany become liberal? And what kind of liberal did it become? Do you feel qualified to answer that? Like, how does the German spirit like interact with this liberal, which is more British, it's more Anglo, and it's got a different character to it. But and yet after World War II, it seems like you guys kind of were forced to become either communists or liberals. And I'm sure, but the German character has to authentically operate in a German way.
So first of all, I haven't lived in Germany for over 10 years, so I'm
Okay.
actually not very well grounded in the current situation there. Um, so when I think of Germans, I think of them being, I would say if you're an artist, you should move to Germany. We are very explicit in our communication. And similarly, I would say many Germans relate to the law. They take it very seriously. They try to not even touch the framework because, right, I think there's the saying, Germans live in a box and they love their box. And
Hmm.
this includes that administrative system and the legal system, where people have quite some belief in its validity and in there being a right way of doing things, and that big part of this is coming from the government. This is not true for all Germans, of course, but overall, people have a lot of respect for such structures. Um, so when I just look at just how Germans deal with exactly these structures, like it just, sorry, but Nazi Germany is just not surprising to me ever. Just Germans are so inherently administrative and literal, and I think from my own experience or how I see it, also in the last decades, they got some ideas from Americans who have this, like they also use large words. And then the Germans were like, oh, yeah, we should explicitly do this. We should let everyone in. We should be the first one to adopt all the climate change mitigations and inspire everyone to do the same. While the Americans, I feel like they were not so literal about it. How
Hmm.
do you see that?
Yeah. No, I see that too. Yeah, and even the way that Germany approaches the idea of hate speech is very analytical and kind of severe in its application. I don't know if you want to
Yeah.
compare it to like Britain or anything like that, but it's like, whoa, you guys are really going that far. Um,
Yeah. Yeah, I think Germany is also continuing with being just very, very anti-right wing. So just wherever you go, you have some gegen rechts, anti-right demonstration. And I think this is part of why it's so hard to even engage with literature on the other side, because right, it doesn't say against right-wing extremism, but just against right in general. And you feel like every educated person thinks that this is the right stance to be. So there's some kind of uh,
hmm,
well, a priori you should be left-wing stance to still just make really, really sure that we achieved the never again after World War II. So
hmm.
I feel like this is very strongly noticeable that this has to this day shaped German culture and that they're very, very careful because of this against any extreme voices on particularly the right.
On the right. You said you haven't lived in Germany for 10 years, and your conversion, or at least reformation of your political identity, perhaps your spiritual and religious identity, has happened outside of Germany. To what degree to what degree did you have to navigate, I guess, like shame or like ooh, the right, like in exploring and being open to the right, was there some residual whatever you said about the German like strong rejection of the right? Did you have to kind of overcome that in yourself?
Oh, definitely. And more importantly, so I've lived in Austria for the majority of the time since then. And well, I've been in many communities, including the global shapers of the World Economic Forum, that are very on much on the other side. And there was definitely, um, well, I think recently I had one conversation about the political compass where my result was just slightly conservative, and even there I already got quite some, oh really, like you could like immediate judgment. So, and it was not very it was pretty much center, but like slightly there was already a strong reaction. So in practice I have not particularly in Germany, but in my personal
Yeah.
network, I've lost many friends over this. I'm
Hmm.
careful with what I say, and even though like, I still, I mean, I want to make this really explicit. I think I hold very moderate views. Nothing of what I think is should be shocking by any means.
Hmm. Why do you think that there's such a strong reaction to anything conservative in the elite spheres that you circulated?
Well, I guess they're all educated by the universities, and at the university there is in fact a certain very strong bent, and it's very noticeable. And I think when I was at university, I even there were lots of things I carefully noticed that this seems a bit weird. Yet even if you do this, there is still it's just so pervasive, they just can't get outside of the frame in a sense.
Hmm. Where does
And
that?
this, of course, continues.
Where do you think that leads the universities? Where do you think the universities are headed because of this almost demonization of the right wing?
Well, not in a good direction.
Towards what, irrelevance or towards lopsidedness?
Well, definitely that, but yeah, I really dislike making these grand statements because, again,
Yeah.
right, I'm just starting out really grappling with all these questions. But personally, I have lost a lot of interest because of it. Like for example, thought about going back to actually continuing, and then I looked at the department, and all the examples were just so strongly political, and in a sense also very, very, how do you say it? Like just zoning in into a very small subset of questions you can even tackle that are, in a sense, just very uninteresting because of it.
Mm.
Like, I'm
Mm.
not saying one shouldn't do it, right? I mean, there are some trans people. Please do some research into this phenomenon, but it should be balanced in relation to how large the phenomenon is. And there is just an infinity of other interesting questions that also bear a lot of potential importance. And it just seems like it's very like they're just neglecting a lot of other important questions because of it.
Hmm.
Same with climate change, of course.
This is a good pivot to cognitive science. Um, what is that? It's not a squishy field, but it's interdisciplinary, I guess is the right way to say
Very
it, which kind
interdisciplinary.
of makes it squishy. But what was it about it? What was it about it that attracted you to that?
Actually, what attracted me to it is the opposite of what I want from it now and what I like about it now.
Hmm.
So I studied psychology as my undergraduate, and well, I was always very interested in minds in general, consciousness, but also in particular the human mind. I think it's by far the most interesting thing in the world.
Hmm.
My favorite writer as a teenager was Oliver Sacks, in case you know him.
The
Um,
man who thought
so
his wife was a hat. Is that the right
that's a
title?
book he wrote, yes.
Yes.
Yes, exactly. Um, so I first studied psychology, and during that time, there was actually an important the replication crisis, in case you've heard of it. So basically, one method of finding out whether your results hold is replicating them. And during the time I studied, it turned out that most of the things psychology had ever done did in fact not replicate, and the methods were very fundamentally flawed. So I had just gone to university, studied a lot of ideas and the methods, and then I learned that I had to already throw out half of the methods,
Oh
sorry,
no.
half of the theories and half of the things I had just learned as knowledge. So I was seeking more of a foundation to stand on. And in cognitive science, one part is that you apply the computational lens, so a very, very formal approach to understanding things. And at that time, I felt like if I study cognitive science and attempt a significantly more mathematical, formal, and computational approach, these ideas would be way more powerful and robust than the simple empirical approach that I found in psychology.
Hmm. How does one computate the mind, or what do you mean by computation? Like are we just what's the data set and just
How we compute the mind. No, okay, let me go back and actually make some definitions here of what cognitive science actually is.
thank you.
Okay, so cognitive science is the study of the mind or of information process and knowledge in across different systems.
Hmm.
So, for example, right, like both computers, brains, or more abstractly, minds, or of course other animals, process information somehow. They have cognition in some sense. And on some level of analysis, there is some similarity in what this means. So the original paradigm is kind of this question of how do different systems process information and in the end have knowledge, which means like reach their goal, right? How do they become intelligent or rational? So it's this very strong analogy between very different things. And as you said, because of this, it's also very interdisciplinary, but it also subscribes to certain notions of how to even pose this question.
Hmm.
So, for example, if you go back in the history, I have made this amazing map of the history of cognitive science, and I think studying the history of a field is very, very telling. So, when we look at the founding fathers of cognitive science, one of them was Herbert Simon, and he was, well, political scientist. He was one of the founding fathers of artificial intelligence. But a book he has also written is about administrative behavior. So he also made an analogy not just between brains and computers, but also between administrative systems. Because in the end, the analogy, of course, applies even further, not just to computers and brains, but also to institutions. Because in the end, you ask the question of knowledge and how that works.
Hmm. This is really fascinating. I just want to nail it down. Stupid, perhaps, question. What is information? Like, just like, yeah.
Yeah.
How do you just abstract that into something that you can just interpose in all these different systems, from a mind to a HR department?
I think in information theory, information is defined as something that makes a meaningful difference, and it's a measure of surprise.
Hmm.
Right. So information theory would approach this all mathematically. But exactly, I mean, this is a very profound question, as is what even is a mind and how can we study it? What if I create a computer model that can replicate some behavior, what does it tell me about the target organism or target phenomenon? Like, how does this even translate? So even asking this question is very, very important. And precisely because there are so many problems with studying it as purely from an information theory kind of perspective, there were a lot of paradigm shifts where people noticed, well, exactly, this notion is very problematic and very propositional in a sense.
What do you mean propositional?
So before the cognitivist paradigm, there was like, actually I have to look it up in detail which was, there was just a simple like logicist approach, but simply just like if A is true, what then do this? So a very simplified approach of studying these systems. Which logicist just means like by logical propositions, right?
Yeah.
If proposition A is true and so forth.
Yeah. And then how did you dropped the cognitivist revolution, or how did what is cognition? I'm sorry about these really basic questions. I'm just
No,
trying
it's
to keep.
great. I love it actually. It's fun, and it also reminds me that well, over time you also forget these answers. Like even like it's actually getting really hard because it has been such a long time ago. But so, for example, historically, it was quite interesting, right? So we had a lot of psychology is a long field in a sense, right? We've studied the soul and the mind,
Mm-hmm.
so as long as we have philosophy. And in like the beginning of the 20th century, we had some new approaches. So one was, for example, the behaviorist paradigm. Do you know what behaviorism is?
Could you just
Please,
for
yes, of
for
course.
this conversation?
Okay, so before, for example, you would use a lot of introspection to make sense out of how, for example, perception in humans works. And then there were these very strong contenders who said, well, it's very hard to actually know what's going on. Let's completely study the mind as a black box, right? Let's look at a system like a mind or an animal from an input-output perspective. So we had Skinner, like with the Skinner box, right? Where you just look, okay, if I reward this animal, it does more of this and this behavior. I make no assumptions of what's going on in its brain or in its cognition, but I can see more of this behavior.
Yeah.
So very simple experiments that completely neglected any attempt at making statements about what is going on inside the animal or inside the human. I think this was also during a time where people had some political notions about, for example, right, like creating the new man and the new human by just new conditioning in its
Mm-hmm.
environment.
Yeah.
So again, right, so the scientific ideas and political ideas, I think they have always interacted, and we always had certain ideas of what a human is and what a human can be and what a human should be. But in particular in the scientific domain, we then had the cognitive revolution where we re-established that first of all there is something going on inside the mind or the brain or however you want to call it, and that we can know something about it.
Hmm.
So one of it was Chomsky, who I think he wrote about, well, just like how language works, and that language cannot just be like language behavior. You have to, right? You have to actually have something inside of your head and remember certain things to produce language.
Mm-hmm.
You cannot just be an input-output system. And then another important study was about how rats navigate mazes, and that they're not just learning left, right, and so forth to just find through the maze, but they actually have a map inside their head, which the experimental results showed that it is necessary for them to have an inside representation of the environment to navigate it. So there was a strong shift to show no, it's necessary to make this assumption, and we can know something about it, and therefore we
Mm-hmm.
have to study it.
So ideas like the mental models came
Yes.
became
Yes.
solidified,
Yeah. That's
and
from
the
Johnson Laird. Yes.
from Laird, and then on the linguistic side of things, we have somewhere in our head we have a dictionary that we're pulling from, and we don't think
Yeah.
through each word unless you're haven't had your coffee or you're getting a little
Yeah.
old or you're too young. We just can automatically recall this. So there's a database there, and then we're accessing the database to do something with the
Yes.
database. So
Yes.
what
Exactly.
happens once you? Oh, go on, please.
Yeah, so I think one easy example for a cognitive model that's quite powerful and describes something that maps uh, to reality is just the idea of short-term memory, long-term memory, and or and working memory and so forth.
Hmm.
Because well, that's first of all it's interesting because we're not making a neuroscience statement. We're not making an argument about how your brain as an organ is structured. There's not one part that's short-term memory and one that's long-term memory, but it's precisely a level of how we process information, where you have you have attention that filters a lot of information already. Then you have some part that is engaging short term and holds right some chunks of information in short term memory. And if you then do certain things repeatedly, it will get transferred into long term memory. And then different things are true about the different systems here without it mapping directly to an organ. So in this case, it's not behaviorist. I am straightforwardly making an argument that's not a black box. I'm looking inside the box. But yeah, but it's also not an organic. It's not a statement about the brain either. It's strictly an information processing statement.
What do you do with that? What do you do with this almost spirit level or matrix level of the organism? So there is obviously the behavior, there's the environment, and there's obviously a brain, but there's this thin veneer that we can call consciousness that arises
Yes.
through these cognitive processes. So cognition is information processing and there's different layers to it. But then we also have a notion that we're conscious.
Yes.
Is that still woo? Like consciousness is still like kind
No.
of this woo spiritual thing. Is
It
there?
was very woo. I think a lot of very established people for a long time tried to explain consciousness away as this epiphenomenon, right? Because science, which brings me back to what I said before, right? Because science tries to be third person view
Mm,
from the universe, objective, and now it looks at an first person uh, entity. Of course, it is blind to the first person. It is blind to the subjective. It's blind to consciousness. And then when you explain this perspective well, you often explain consciousness away, and you see it purely as an epiphenomenon of a more reductionist view of the human.
just to nail that down, what do you mean by epiphenomena? That sounds derogatory. It's
Like a kind of a side product.
okay. And nothing in and
So
of
this is
itself.
exactly. This is, for example, I mean, this is quite an important thing to just like how deeply entrenched the idea of epiphenomena is. So if you're a full physicalist reductionist, you think, right? I guess you believe in the reality of atoms, right? Like atoms
I've
exist.
never seen one, but I take it as a statement of faith that
Yes.
there's
Okay.
these
So
fundamental
same. So
things.
I
Yeah.
think atoms probably exist. It makes sense in
I know that
context.
we
And
can manipulate them with certain degrees of consistency for our material
exactly.
life.
Yes. Okay. So atoms exist. We're made out of atoms. And the problem is to hold this view and study the whole world through this lens of reductionism. It can happen that people end up with what is called a desert ontology. They don't just
Hmm.
think, okay, we're like functionally, we're made out of atoms, but they end up with a view where the only thing that's real is the atoms and everything else is an epiphenomenon, right? Like, so humans don't really exist. They're just atoms bouncing around because the only real thing is the lowest level of analysis.
Hmm.
This sounds really
Hmm.
funny, but people get this often wrong in more practical context. So, for example, one thing people very easily say is, especially like as a teenager, love doesn't exist. It's just chemicals.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Which is all of this is the same fallacy, which is a desert ontology, where you think because there are lower levels of analyses and we can study those with more precision and with more certainty,
Yeah.
therefore they're more real than others.
There's to make it geeky. I guess this is already a geeky conversation, so I don't have to worry about that. But I really enjoy board games, and I used to enjoy video games, but I kind of translated into board games, more tactile, more present, and then more communicative, more communal.
Yes.
But there's hundreds and hundreds. You're a German. Germans are just like pumping up board games like crazy. Like you guys are creating board games, and they're fascinating. And there's this whole art form of board games, like stacking on and
Yeah.
having this dialogue among you. So there's these reviewers that go through
Not
and
me,
play.
but yes. Yeah.
No, not you. No, I'm sorry. Not
Yeah.
all Germans. Hashtag. But there's these reviewers that go through and they try to say what's a good board game, what's a bad board game. And one meme that happens in the review is like, you get these dopamine hits. And I really dislike that on a visceral level,
Yeah.
which is another reduction analogy. But I dislike reducing fun into
Yeah.
dopamine. I know that
Yeah.
when I take a shower, I feel good, and I know there's a chemical going on in there. I know there's a reward system
Yeah.
because I know that I'm
Exactly.
an animal. But there's something actually more important
Yeah.
about the activity of the board game, or why I find it enjoyable, than just chemicals in the brain.
Yes.
Or
I agree. Yeah.
like a hug
I,
isn't just oxytocin. I'm not just like
no.
oxytocin. There's something more. So how do we establish a finer level of thinking that can be that? How can we incorporate science, computation, all these material ways of viewing into the more spiritual or aesthetic or finer aspects of life? Like, how do we make those
Mm.
successive leaps while still not slipping into woo, while still having some amount of, I guess, seriousness, or there's a word I'm trying to think of, like exactitude in our description.
Well, all these phenomena are real, right? We do
Okay.
understand quite a lot about the reward system, the chemicals underneath. But if you, in the wrong context, use this language, it might hint at you thinking this is more real than just the level of the human experience. And in a sense, because of it, it also devalues simply the level of just being human, right? When I say, oh, right, it gives you dopamine, instead of just saying it's rewarding, I prioritize one level of analysis over another one. And this one, I prioritize this objectivist, like not even biological, but just like reductionist perspective over simply the human, straightforward experience of this is a rewarding game, right?
Mm-hmm.
And by you, and part of the information or part of the meaning of the statement is not just, well, saying that it is based on dopamine, but it's also a statement about which perspective I find important and valuable and disregarding another one. So I understand why you would find it aesthetically unpleasing, and I agree.
Yeah. Deprioritizing and prioritizing. When we get to the level, well, taking the really geeky board game analogy and of reducing a game to dopamine, it also has the effect, that way of viewing things has the effect of having a distressed teenager come into your psychiatrist office and seeing them as just a system of chemicals and neurons mixed firing them, and prioritizing chemicals over other sorts of solutions because the
Yes.
chemical's the most real thing, and there's all these side effects. So there's a bunch of subjectivity, but all subjectivity on the chemical level is just chalked up to complexity rather than seeing, oh, it's just complex. Like, we don't know how this drug will affect you, but we know that drug will probably answer. Well, it's more
Yes.
concretely
Yes.
answerable. So it seems like cognitive science, and I have spoken with John Vervaeke, several times about
Oh,
this, and
that's
I've
wonderful.
listened to his stuff a lot. I have his book that I'm working through on the meaning crisis, where you start to introduce values. Like, no, there's solutions around human distress that it actually performs violence on the human being to reduce them into a
Yes.
chemical system or a material system. They're a narrative being, perhaps, right? We think of them in terms of story, in terms of his words, agent and arena. Like, there's a human being
Yes.
in time and space. And so I wonder, is that a part of the cognitive revolution, or in the field of cognitive science, like understanding storytelling, understanding values, which I think are basically a narrative thing. We
Yeah.
communicate values through story, and we communicate our experience through story. So there's something about it that's actually scientifically robust. I don't know why I keep on going down to science. It sounds like I'm kind of reducing it to science, but I'm wondering if cognitive science is trying to incorporate those levels of analysis into a robust system.
Many questions.
Yeah, sorry, I do that when I get excited.
So I'm not sure cognitive science does this in general, but cognitive science is very broad and does many different things.
Yeah.
The paradigms, there's many different paradigms, and they also
Yeah.
still work. There's still people that work in behaviorism, for example, to this day. And for certain questions, this is still a very valuable paradigm to apply.
Yeah.
Because it's a method, and you have to, in a sophisticated manner, choose the framework or the paradigm, and then the methods you want to use to ask a certain question, study a certain phenomenon. Then, so John Vervaeke has a very particular work that he's doing, and it's not a thing that cognitive science in general or everyone is doing, and that's exactly why it's so special, because he does precisely what he is doing. But there was also, I think, a newfound appreciation of the question of narrative across disciplines recently. Right, I
Really?
mean, Jordan Peterson talks about it in Maps of Meaning. John Vervaeke talks about it. But for example, there's also more economists that are now talking about narrative economics. I think his name is Schiller, if I remember correctly. And there's also David Tuckett, who works on, I think his theory is called conviction narrative theory, where he also talks precisely about a topic that I actually also studied, which is decision making under uncertainty. Right, decision making under uncertainty. Any attempt to quantify information or use data, it's always relative to a reference point. It's always you always have to make meaning out of what is going on, and there's always a certain ideology behind it, right? So when I look at market information, I'm not just reacting to something happening over there, but I have an idea of what it means, right? For example, that there's something really big happening over here. And therefore extrapolated in a certain direction. So there's a lot of the relevance of narrative is definitely becoming more important in other disciplines as well. So this has definitely happened. But coming back to cognitive science, so the cognitivist revolution is not. I mean, it also has some importance of just like a theory-based view of reality. But more important have been the more recent paradigm shifts or other attempts at understanding humans or minds or whatever you want to study from a cognitive science perspective. And John Vervaeke is part of this cluster of attempts. And I would say, so am I. And it's called 4E cognition. Maybe you've heard the term by him before.
Like 4 E's? The
Yes.
letter E?
So
So, yeah.
yes, exactly. So it means extended, embodied, and active and embedded. And it redefines how we. So in the cognitivist tradition, you think, right, you have an agent and you have the environment, and then you have certain kind of information processing and interaction going on. But in practice, this is not how it's actually, it's not that clear cut. And as an analogy, it breaks down in many, many important contexts. So for example, well, first of all, I'm embodied, right? I'm not just here with my brain, but my body already contains, by its structure, phylogenetically, a lot of information about how I'm directly coupled to my environment, right? I'm able to breathe in this level of oxygen because I was optimized by evolution to be able to exist. So my body contains a lot of information about the environment and is coupled not just by randomly now being here and there being the environment, but it has been, how to say it,
Attuned.
co-created in a sense. Attuned,
Co-created.
perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is the embodiment question, and we can see, for example, the questions of embodiment also in language. A lot of there's this work of metaphors we live by. So a lot of analogies we use very naturally, they're directly grounded in our physical being, right? When I say this lifts me up, it's because when I'm in a good mood, I will stand differently than when something makes me down, right? It's very directly linked. And a lot of meaning making, even in our abstract language systems, directly stemming from how we experience our own body and how the body interacts with the environment. So we have embodiment, then we have embeddedness, which is just I'm directly in the environment, in ongoing interaction and therefore I'm also fundamentally constrained, right? I cannot jump from one environment to the next, but I have directly be there. And then we have extended. So it's particular for humans, right? Psychology is trying to study humans in a very general way, but of course humans are part of a culture, and they basically have this entire cluster of artifacts and institutions that actually helps them do their human things, which is what traditionally anthropology would study. So it's, anthropology studies humans in context, in their cultural context, while psychology rips it out. And extended cognition takes into account exactly this, that for example, my information processing extends in the environment, for example, by using calculation devices, by using pen and paper, right? I can take notes, and then my notes will reflect back will, for example, extend my memory. My memory is no longer just in my brain suddenly, but it's also on paper. It's also in my smartphone. My smartphone affects me back and is now part of right, very profoundly part of how I interact with the world. So you cannot just say, oh, right, you are inside of your brain, but you extend in the environment in very meaningful ways. Same goes for just the social environment. Well, and then I think now I've said three of them. The fourth one is an activism, which just emphasizes that we're not this dual being of like, right, just a mind and a body and then the environment, but we're in this ongoing interaction with the environment. And in the end, all our thoughts, they have the rubber has to hit the road, and this sensory motor action loop is more importantly the phenomenon to focus on, instead of seeing it as two separate things.
You
That was a
tweeted.
very long answer.
No, no, this is fascinating stuff, and we can, with those tools, you can really get into a lot of these different areas that are very
Yes.
interesting. You posted something on X. I can't really recall it. Maybe I should pull it up, but you were talking about the differences in the way that men and women process information and behave
Yes.
are grounded in their bodies. And
Yes.
I did a lot of work in the gender question and transgenderism and the effects of psychology and pharmacology on young people, and this phenomena of transgenderism as kind of a fad or kind of a cultural phenomena. And
Yes.
one way in which people who would say that they're feminists, and biologists have attacked the transgender question is to prioritize sex as a gamete question. A woman is that which produces the large gamete. A man is that which produces the small gamete. And while that debunks certain wild ideas in the transgender front, it doesn't encapsulate what a woman is. Like the question, what is a
No,
woman, is actually profound. It's a profound
it
question
is.
because it's not just what you produce, it's all the different things that went into you being able to produce that, and being in a lineage of people who produce
Yes.
that, and then being in cultural contexts that successfully reproduce people who reproduce. And then also mating structures, mating strategies, which can be culturally, there's a cultural aspect on what is masculine, what's feminine, pink and blue being a very reductionist way of describing that. But there's also all this information that's being given off of, that's being prioritized in a woman in her environment. A man and a woman's relationship to time is different. And you could even make really interesting questions and jokes and comedy sketches about how long it takes for a woman to get out the house or put her clothes on, as opposed to a man. And there's biological aspects to it, but there's something more than just biology happening on here. I'm wondering if you have any interest in exploring or like breaking open any questions that you've found in the gender discussion with regard to these different levels of analysis and being embodied, being enacted, being embedded, and being extended. I don't know how that maps on to your insight into the
Um,
gender discussion argument slash.
well, yeah, it's definitely another excellent question. I again associate wildly a different question I prefer to answer, which
Yeah, please do.
in this case, so you brought the example of what is a woman, right? And then this reduction to gametes. And when we look at the transgender question, people get infuriated by it. And one part why this is the case is because it's this very clear ground where the different ideologies clash with their values very directly. And therefore, it's a very ideological clash. I think, and it's a difficult question, but I do think it matters. But what I would argue is you could literally take any other category and it could be as divisive because categories are just very hard in practice. So, for example, there's this book by Douglas Hofstadter, and it's called, oh God, now I forgot how it's called, something analogies, surfaces and essences. And he shows exactly this problem that no category has an essence. It's surface all the way down in a very real way. So if, for example, ask me about what is a chair, right? Like
Yeah.
what is a chair? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, it's this surface thing you can sit on. It has four legs and it has the thing where you can lean against. Okay, but now sometimes a chair is just, like maybe more like a ball or something that you can sit on, and you will use it as a chair. And pragmatically, it serves the purpose of now being a chair. But is it truly a chair? We do not know, right? And I think sometimes I really do understand why the ideological systems clash around the transgender question so much. It's very noticeable. But I think some part is just the actual, like the cognitive science or just the philosophical question of what is a category, because there is just no essence to any category, and you could literally take anything else. Exactly right. Like if I take some weird designer kind of chair, and I ask you, is this truly a chair? We'll have some issues.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes me
So,
think. Yeah.
but
Continue.
I think maybe to actually say something about your original question about, I think like the I guess sex differences. So first of all, maybe I should say what my argument was in this Twitter post. If is that interesting to repeat?
Yeah. Please. Please.
So Raw Egg Nationalist made a point about why he will never understand why women, I think, why do they want to be liked so much? Like he just doesn't understand it. He has always liked to just, I guess, just be disagreeable and even be hated for, just how he was. And I made the point back that, well, it's actually quite simple, because, well, men and women are physically different, and minds or whatever is going on mentally is meant to optimize the interaction with the environment. And because men and women are so different, they fundamentally have to solve very different problems. Because what the subjective meaning world, the Umwelt, is determined partially by how you are embodied in the world. And one part of the female condition is that you're not just in relative terms, but in absolute terms weaker. Therefore, you're way more prone to be a victim of violence. And one way of optimizing this is to just be, well, kind and people-pleasing and very agreeable. And this is completely consistent with what we know, which is that women are way more agreeable. So I guess you should hashtag check his privilege of being very strong.
Well, no, that goes back. That kind of is just as contentious against the radical feminist talking point, kind of, where they decry that they're always expected to be kind. They're expected to
Yes.
be pretty, as though society's forcing it on them. And sure, there is social pressure. To what degree it's coming
Yeah.
from men as opposed to women is an open
Yes.
question. But also, to what degree is that actually a strategy of survival and of gaining
Yes.
reputation and managing reputation and
Yes.
securing
Yeah,
security?
I think this points towards a very important part, which is um, that what you attribute this part of reality to. I think it makes sense to argue that this is the case, and that women have to be, in a sense, more people pleasing and agreeable. But now the question is it something that men unfairly or intentionally put on women, or is it part of an underlying reality that we just will not ever be able to overcome?
Hmm.
And I think understanding in particular this underlying base reality, and there might be some, or there most likely is some inequality just baked in, right, into how things just are. But I think understanding this also frees one from, well, first of all, the notion that there is something to improve in a fundamental way. If it's just right, if it's just ontologically very, very deep, then it's better to accept certain realities. Not too much, but still. But it
Hmm.
also, I think it also very profoundly frees up the relationship between men and women, right?
Hmm.
If I can say, well, this is unfair. I don't want to do this, yet it's not your fault.
Hmm. Hmm. When you were speaking about the category question and you brought up the
Yes.
chair, as opposed to the
What is a
woman,
chair?
what is a woman? What is a
Yes.
chair? What is a woman was not, well, no, it was directly, it was just assumed that the category was stable. And then the
Yes.
process of liberal democracy came around and started to upset the traditional category of the woman with regard to what a woman can and cannot do, can and cannot own, started to question those effectual categories of the woman. But
Yes.
that led to the erosion, or that put women, that put the category of woman into political discourse.
Yes.
And if a chair became, if the question of what is a chair became a political question, it does have essence. Chair would then have essence, but it has political essence because whatever power touches
Oh, no, 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 no. It
changes the
doesn't
nature of
suddenly
the
have.
category.
Sorry for interrupting.
Yeah, please.
It does not suddenly become an essence, but we will have to behave as if it had an essence
Yeah.
because we have to formalize or operationalize it in legal terms to, for example, defend against certain other views
Hmm.
that are even more wrong than pretending there was an essence.
Oh, that you slipped something in there that's profound. So we attribute essence to it because to not that's the best of all options in certain
Yes,
political
yes,
situations. I just wonder how that, because you brought up cognitive science's relationship to administrations and to
yes,
the human systems. One of the big contentions around liberal versus right wing discourse is the nature of power, the nature of hierarchy, and what is power. And power, there's one formulation of power that absolute power corrupts absolutely. And that's just, that sounds like kind of liberal hand waving or hand washing of the real deep question of how does power operate and how do we optimize power to operate in the best possible way? And understanding categories, first seeing that power manipulates categories is really important. Just see like what is a woman is a political question that really depends on a political reality above and beyond the biological reality. But it has have back and forth because what is a woman is directly related to what is a child and what is a human being and what is a clump of cells. Like the abortion debate
yes,
is like starts to question what is the category of a human and when is a human being eligible to be a legal entity that is afforded certain legal rights. That's a huge political question. I don't really have a question. It's really fascinating that the questions that you're asking around category, philosophical questions around
yes.
categories, are very important in understanding the culture war or any sort of political conflict that we're currently embroiled in. There's deep
Yes.
philosophical issues in play
Yes,
here.
definitely. I think to, well, use administration and state power, you have to somehow represent your citizens and, well, therefore idealize them, right? Which is what James Scott talks about in seeing like a state. You have to abstract in a way where they're just abstract entities, yet your way of abstracting can interact with the environment or with what you're responsible for in a way that can also, because any idealization always ignores a profound surplus of meaning that you can never, right, you can never put in data in your representation. Whatever you ignore will always come back haunting you in your
Hmm.
representations.
Hmm. Well, then, how do you limit what you ignore while still being able to make decisions, right?
Oh, excellent question. So this is actually what the whole meta-rational framework David Chapman writes about this argues, right? So we need formalization. It helps us in practice to make things tractable. Administration is very useful, but you have to also understand that no formal system can ever entail everything. You have to use different ones depending on goals, goals and context. And you have to understand that because you can use different ones for different contexts and, well, they're not all encompassing, you need this fluid approach between them. So you have to behave as if we could measure and formalize certain things because it's useful. So you must formalize, yet you must also understand the limitations of these methods because otherwise you pay a very, very high price for it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's one frustration that I had specifically within the gender discourse, where from the radical feminist perspective, all stereotypes are oppressive, but that's not a fluid enough way to deal with gender because those stereotypes are going to be more or less accurate in certain contexts. So being able to pick up and set down stereotypes is preferable than praising stereotypes and turning everything into stereotypes, or completely deconstructing all stereotypes, because you're just going to have to create new
Yes.
stereotypes, and you're already basically using the stereotypes in a lot of your arguments anyways. So being able to switch, it's the problem aren't the categories. The problem is the articulation of categories. The problem isn't the language. It's the lack or surplus of poets in the language, right? The people who are using the language. You use the language correctly or incorrectly based on the context and what you're trying to do with it. And certain people are bad at language and certain people are really good at language, but we don't blame language for the problems inherent in language,
Yes.
right?
Yeah. Which is coming back to what I've said before about, right, feminists blaming men for them having to be people pleasing. And I don't know why I even associated this now, but I think one other topic that men get, which I've also talked about already, is men sometimes get accused for exactly the reality of violence. And I think this is also something when you accept that how game theoretically deep the reality of violence is, I think you will suddenly become way more compassionate with men because you understand it's not them that chose this to be real, but because they are physically stronger, they have to be the ones that, well, act in this umwelt, whether it's the military or just like defense against, well, like another man. Of course, women are in the same physical reality, but because they're so underpowered, they are less directly related to just the groundedness in force. So of course, men often also do choose to perpetuate violence, no question, or choose fights that are unnecessary. But I think they are not responsible for the ontological reality of violence. And I think seeing that because of that, they also have to deal with a lot, actually with the harshest part of reality. I think this gives a deeper understanding of both how it is, of course, very vulnerable to be a woman that cannot even be part of this
Making decisions of certain types.
part
Yeah.
of this dimension, yet men being, well, forced to engage with it. But of course, it's still their responsibility to minimize it, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And they generally are rewarded by minimizing violence with
Yes.
a wooing woman, perhaps, um, if that's what they even want. What are some of the things that you're working on now, or like spending your attention on?
Mhm. Okay, so the things I've done recently are, so one of the things are I've worked with John Vervaeke on this work on rationality and relevance realization,
Hmm.
which got actually mentioned on his Jordan Peterson Academy course on intelligence and rationality. So that was very pleasant. Well, I do public speaking where I communicate those ideas in various circles. So, for example, the Fluidity Forum, which is this meta-rational, meta-modern event in Detroit. I'm also working on the difference of, well, the machine metaphor versus biological system, so life versus machine. And I think the machine metaphor is a very profoundly problematic view if you use it beyond, again, its usefulness. So that's one of the things I've
Wait,
done. And
so just pausing on that, the machine versus the what metaphor, the biological
life. So, right,
life.
because we see a lot of things through a mechanical framework or a machine metaphor, whether it's politics or even humans. Right, because of AI and all these works, the computer metaphor has become very, very strong. And I think life is very, very different, works by very different principles. And well, this would be a very long conversation now to really go into it. So I'm
Okay.
gonna skip it and continue
But
with
hold
what I'm
on, but
currently
hold on, hold
doing.
on. No. I
So
need to know what do you mean by life? Just give the dog a bone here. Like what are some of the principles of life? What do you mean by life?
um,
Is it because
well, I mean,
it became really popular about 20 years ago for people to say organic? It's a very organic process, like they're appealing to something more than the mechanical by saying organic.
yes.
But
No, I think
organic is just another
the
system.
no, no, an organism and a machine are very different, and
Okay, organism.
the main theory that I still very much like is the idea of autopoiesis by Maturana and Varela, about this idea of self creation, self maintenance, and creation. A system brings forth its own structure continuously, while a machine, if one part breaks, it's fragile. It's very fragile. All its agency comes from the outside, from the engineer that has built it for a purpose. While an agentic, autopoietic system constantly self-organizes, maintains itself, and brings forth its own structure coherently over time.
Okay,
Yes.
good. It's just like our
And this metaphor
conversation.
is, yes, exactly. Yeah, it's very self-organizing. Okay, so other things I'm working on. So one other thing I'm working on is Vitalik has this pop-up village called Susalu, and I'm a part of the team that creates the cognitive foundations for Susalu. And the main idea we're working on is the idea of cognitive sovereignty, which I think other people like Jim Rutt, they've also talked about it. And it's this stance. So basically, it's the cognitive theory of what it means to be based. Because so on one hand, I think the search for truth is, well, inherently valuable, but there's also an ethical aspect to it because, well, if I believe wrong things, I do things that are, well, not as intended, and by telling you wrong things, you will then also do things that might, for example, harm you, right? You think, oh, this thing is healthy for me, you eat it and you die. Me not actually properly wrestling with the truth and telling you I've harmed you by not orienting myself towards the truth. But one important substance that's extremely important is a stance of taking responsibility for my beliefs, because I will never actually know what's true. I will always be in relative ignorance, and I have to defer to other people, like clearly in a collective intelligence problem where I have to choose who I give who I defer
Expertise
to
too.
in my
Yes.
judgments, right?
Yes.
Exactly. Who is an expert? And so I will often say, well, I believe this because this person said so. Yet there's this underlying choice I have to make of taking ownership of this deferring. I cannot say, oh, but they said so, right? Because in the end, it's still me that is fundamentally responsible in choosing who I listen to and in what my beliefs are on certain topics. And this topic matters to me precisely because, well, I very strongly subscribe to many ideologies that I find very problematic in retrospect. And when we look at well, Susalu tries to wrestle with some questions around governance and basically top-down systems we can build. And my perspective here is exactly this bottom-up answer, right? What does any political system mean to not become totalitarian? And when we look at the writing of Solzhenitsyn, when we look at Miloš, it's always this problem of people, well, staying silent when they should speak up, becoming blind to things they choose not to notice because it's easier, and well, not being cognitive sovereign in a certain way. So that's also something I've now worked on multiple years, and I still intend to write more about as well.
Just to maybe push it a little bit against that, maybe the examples of totalitarianism that we find problematic aren't representative of whatever we call totalitarianism. Maybe certain
Yes,
forms of political coherence
yes,
accept the minimization of individual liberty for a greater good, and can maybe there's trade-offs, and maybe maximizing liberty is particular for certain peoples and not necessarily expedient for other people's. It's another way of formulating what we were talking about with the World Economic Forum, the Masters of the Universe. I love the phrase global shapers. That is the most hubristic, self-important. Like
Give it to me.
I'm gonna shape the globe. I would just caution against one, without saying that we have to be very careful with increased political homogeny and the trade-offs inherent in that, trying to maximize individual liberty or cognitive sovereignty, it assumes that everybody's equally cognitive and therefore equally sovereign over their cognition. This is the problem with what do you do with the left half of the bell curve, right? Certain people are better off with more structure than others, right? That you want
Sure. No, no.
less structure
Yeah,
for the creatives and more structure for
sure.
people who are dealing
Yes.
with heavy machinery, right?
I think that's not even the attempt, right?
Okay.
It's about just a stance of how you relate to your own, I guess, opinions and beliefs,
Mm,
and that you exactly take responsibility for it for yourself, right? That you're just never making this one mistake of just saying, "Well, I believe it because this other person said so," because there's still a choice in who you defer, and that you just become conscious of this fact.
hmm. But how do you not like just it is when COVID was going on, there was a lot of arguments about the vaccine, and
Yes.
everybody who was competent in those arguments had 20 references. They all brought their own experts to the field,
Yes.
and they just bashed each other with these papers going back and forth. You don't know what you're talking about. And for
Yes.
most people, like, I don't know. You have to like, it feels better if I do this and it feels better if I do that. Right.
Yes.
Like you can't be totally, you can't really take
No.
responsibility,
No, you
especially
have to
when,
defer. You have to defer, but you
yeah.
have to be conscious that you do defer and be discerning in who you discern to, and you can't excuse your failure by
Okay.
just saying, "I just did what others said," in a
I was
sense, right?
following orders.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. So what's the benefit of taking that responsibility? I guess that's what I'm asking. Like, what's the benefit of taking this step?
Well, hard to verbalize.
Hmm.
I think you more consciously grapple with what you actually think. Yes.
So you achieve fuller self-knowing, which is a good. Okay.
Yes, I mean I could go more into detail. I can link one of the talks I gave on it, and I went more into detail of how well what I like, for example, different pitfalls in achieving the stance that one can very reasonably avoid and become a better truth seeker for it. Yes.
So where can people find your work and connect with you if you're open to connection and are available to be connected to?
Well, I mostly tweet on Twitter or X as Analepticon, Analeptikon.
Okay.
And I do have a Substack, but I intend to write more.
Don't we all?
I think I had a very intentional, no, I actually had a very intentional break because I was standing on stage, uh, spreading ideas well that I now very, very deeply disagree and sometimes find downright problematic.
Wow.
So I think the absolute correct choice was to, well, be quite certain before I talk about
Hmm.
the views I know now instead of just continuing to shout whatever I was thinking.
So you're in a deep process of reformulating
Yes.
your structure, your cognitive structure,
Yes.
belief system. And thank you very much. Hopefully I didn't keep you too long. I know it seems kind of late wherever you are, but I really appreciate the conversation. I'll link to all your work in the description. Do you have, if like, what's one work that you really think more people should read or be aware of? Like if they wanted to follow in your footsteps and really have a mind-opening experience, what's a thinker or a book that,
Oh, something they should read. Oof.
Or a movie, I guess, if that's what you're thinking of, or a song.
Well, I guess right now I would just say, oh no, 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 I know it. Okay, the Systems Bible. Do you
Whoa.
know the Systems Bible?
No, it sounds big.
It's by John Gall. I think actually Jordan Peterson has recommended it before as well, but I knew it before he mentioned it. And it's about how human systems work and usually tend to dysfunction. So the main idea is, well, humans have a problem, so they build a system to solve the problem. Now they have two problems. And then it goes in all the details of how systems fail. And I think it's what makes the book wonderful is that it's both very on point and extremely humorous and funny. So
Okay.
it's a great, and it's also not that long.
Oh, good. So yeah, it's why not read it then?
Yes.
Entertaining and enlightening and short. It's what every growing mind needs. And I'm gonna end the recording right now. Thank you very much for your evening.
Thank you so much for having me.
Hey, I'm in the recording. Sorry if that went off.